The day I signed the divorce papers, my husband smiled like he'd just won something. Not a soft smile, not relief. It was the kind that sits crooked on a man's face when he thinks the future still owes him, when he believes the hard part is over and someone else will carry the weight from here on out. I noticed it because my hand was shaking as I set the pen down, and his wasn't. We were sitting in a narrow office that smelled faintly of old carpet and burnt coffee. The clock on the wall ticked louder than it should have, like it was counting something down just for me. I remember the lawyer clearing his throat, sliding copies across the desk, and asking if we had any final questions. I didn't. My husband did. "So," he said casually, leaning back in his chair, "about the temporary support." That's when I knew. Not later, not weeks after, right then in that office with the ink still wet on my name, I knew my husband thought he could live off me after the divorce, that he believed the end of our marriage wasn't the end of his comfort. And I also knew, quietly, calmly, that he had no idea who he'd been married to all those years. Before everything cracked open, our life looked ordinary from the outside. We lived in a modest two-story house with beige siding and a maple tree out front that dropped its leaves like it was tired every fall. Nothing fancy, nothing fragile either. The kind of home that held birthdays, arguments, and Sunday mornings without asking too many questions. I worked in healthcare administration, long hours, steady pay, the kind of job where people assume you sit behind a desk all day but don't see the phone calls that follow you home, the spreadsheets you replay in your head while brushing your teeth. My husband, Mark, used to work construction. Strong hands, broad shoulders. He was good at it once, before the layoffs, before the temporary breaks that turned permanent. Somewhere along the way, his weeks between jobs stretched longer, and my paycheck quietly became the backbone of our life. At first, I didn't mind. Marriage to me was a shared load, some seasons heavier for one than the other. When Mark's work slowed, I told myself this was my season to carry more. I paid the mortgage, covered the insurance, picked up groceries without checking prices too closely. Mark handled other things, or at least he said he did. He'd promised to fix the leaky faucet, mow the lawn, look for job tomorrow. Tomorrow always came and went, leaving the same list undone. Still, I defended him, to friends, to my sister, even to myself. He's just in a rough patch, I'd say. He's figuring things out. But over time, something shifted. It wasn't dramatic, no shouting matches, no slammed doors. It was quieter than that. Mark began to assume instead of ask. Money from our joint account disappeared faster. When I mentioned it, he'd wave a hand like I was fussing over loose change. "You worry too much. That's what money's for." I started packing my lunches instead of buying them, turning off lights behind him, lying awake at night listening to him snore while my mind ran numbers like prayers. Still, I stayed. I stayed because leaving felt heavier than enduring, because we had history, because I believed love meant patience, even when patience started to feel like self-erasure. The real unraveling didn't start with a fight. It started with a comment, tossed so casually it almost slipped past me. We were sitting at the kitchen table one evening, the air thick with the smell of fried onions. I was sorting bills, the envelopes fanned out like cards I didn't want to play. Mark was scrolling on his phone, feet propped on the chair across from him. "You know," he said without looking up, "if we ever split, you'd be set. You make good money." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it felt awkward, misplaced. "Why would you say that?" I asked. He shrugged. "Just saying, courts usually side with the lower earner. That's how it works." Something in my chest tightened. I tried to brush it off, but the words lingered like a smell you can't air out. After that, the little things grew louder. Mark stopped contributing altogether, not just financially, but emotionally. He slept late, stayed out later. When I asked about job applications, he snapped that I was nagging. When I suggested counseling, he said we didn't need strangers in our business. I began to feel less like a wife and more like a resource. The night I finally said the word divorce, it didn't come out angry, it came out tired. We were standing in the hallway, the light above us flickering like it couldn't decide what mood to settle into. I told him I couldn't do this anymore, that I felt used, that I was lonely in my own marriage. Mark stared at me for a long moment, then he nodded. "Okay," he said, "we'll do it the right way." I didn't know what he meant by that. The weeks that followed were filled with paperwork and polite distance. We spoke like co-workers wrapping up a project. He didn't fight the divorce, didn't plead, didn't apologize. And that should have warned me, because men who have nothing left to lose usually don't look that calm. By the time we sat in that lawyer's office, I was grieving something quietly, but Mark was calculating. I saw it in the way he asked questions, in the way his eyes flicked to my folder, thicker than his. When the lawyer explained spousal support, Mark nodded along like he'd been expecting it. That smile crept back on his face, and in that moment, something inside me settled. Not anger, not fear, resolve. Because I understood then that this divorce wasn't the end of my struggle, it was the beginning of his biggest mistake. The first thing Mark did after the divorce was finalized was nothing. No job applications, no interviews, no sudden burst of responsibility like he'd promised the lawyer with that earnest nod of his head. He moved into a small one-bedroom apartment across town. Cheap carpet, thin walls, the kind of place that echoes when you walk through it because there's nothing much inside. I know this because he told me, repeatedly. He called it downsizing, but the way he said it carried no shame, almost pride, like he was playing a long game I didn't fully understand yet. The court had ordered temporary spousal support, not an outrageous amount, but enough to cover his rent and groceries, enough, apparently, for him to believe he didn't need to hurry into independence. The first check I sent felt like swallowing something bitter. I remember sitting at my kitchen table now, writing his name on the line. The house was quiet in a way it hadn't been for years. No television murmuring in the background, no sighs from the couch, just the hum of the refrigerator and the scratch of pen on paper. I told myself this was temporary, that this was the cost of closing a chapter. Mark didn't see it that way. He started calling more often, not to ask how I was, never that, but to talk about his plans, or lack thereof. "I'm thinking of taking a few months to reset," he said once, his voice relaxed. "Get my head straight." I stood at the sink, watching soap bubbles gather and pop. "Reset from what, Mark? You haven't worked in over a year." "Well, exactly," he said. "I've earned a break." I didn't argue. I'd learned that arguing with Mark only drained me faster. Instead, I listened. I made neutral sounds. I hung up and tried not to let resentment settle in my bones. But it did. He started mentioning money casually, too casually. "Rent went up," he'd say. "Groceries are crazy expensive now. Gas prices, huh?" Each comment was a nudge, a reminder, a test. When I didn't respond the way he wanted, his tone changed. "You're doing fine," he said, almost accusingly. "You've always been good with money." I was good with money because I had to be, because someone always needed something from me. A month after the divorce, I ran into his sister, Denise, at the grocery store. She was reaching for a bag of apples when she froze, eyes flicking from my cart to my face. "Oh," she said, forcing a smile. "Didn't expect to see you." Neither did I. I hadn't spoken to Denise since the separation. She'd always been polite but distant, loyal to her brother in that quiet way siblings often are. We made small talk, weather, produce prices, the awkward dance of people pretending nothing heavy sits between them. Then she said, "Mark's doing okay, considering." I nodded. I hope so. She mentioned you've been very supportive, she added, watching my face carefully. Something in her tone made my grip tighten on the cart. I'm fulfilling a legal obligation, I said evenly. She flushed. Well, he said you promised to make sure he landed on his feet. I stared at her. I never said that. Denise hesitated. He said you felt bad, that you know he sacrificed his career for you. I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I thanked her for the conversation and walked away, my heart pounding louder than the cartwheels against the tile. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan spinning slow circles, replaying Denise's words, sacrificed his career, promised to make sure he landed. Mark wasn't just relying on me financially, he was rewriting our story. And he was telling it to anyone who would listen. The next few weeks confirmed it. Friends stopped inviting me out as often. When they did, conversations felt strained. Someone would mention Mark, then quickly change the subject. At a neighborhood barbecue, a woman I barely knew patted my arm and said, "It's kind of you to help him through this." Help him through what? A divorce he coasted through? I realized then that Mark wasn't just living off my money, he was living off my reputation, off the image of me as the stable, generous ex-wife keeping his poor, lost husband afloat. That's when the first real clue settled in my chest. Not suspicion, but clarity. Mark had no intention of standing on his own. Why would he when I was doing it for him? The moment that solidified everything came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was at work, knee-deep in scheduling issues, when my phone buzzed with a message from him. "Hey, court stuff came in. We might need to talk about extending support." My hands went cold. I excused myself, stepped into an empty conference room, and called him back. "Extend support?" I asked. "Yeah," he said breezily. "My lawyer thinks we can argue that I'm still transitioning. Job market's rough." "Are you even looking?" I asked. Silence. Then, "I don't see why you're getting upset. This was always the plan." "The plan?" My voice shook despite my effort to steady it. "You make good money. I supported you emotionally for years. This balances out." That's when something inside me finally broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. I ended the call without another word. That evening, I sat at my dining table with a cup of tea gone cold, staring at the divorce paperwork before me. I reread the clauses I'd skimmed before, the ones I'd trusted the process to handle fairly. Temporary support, reviewable, based on effort towards self-sufficiency. Effort. I realized then that Mark's confidence, the smile in the lawyer's office, the relaxed phone calls, came from one belief, that I would keep being quiet, that I would keep being kind, that I wouldn't push back. He thought I knew me. What he didn't know was that I'd spent years learning how systems worked, how documentation mattered, how patterns told stories more powerful than emotions ever could. I began to pay attention. I noted the dates he called during business hours, the way his social media filled with pictures from bars, weekend trips, expensive-looking dinners. I saved the messages where he complained about money right after posting photos of new shoes. I didn't confront him, not yet. Instead, I listened, I observed, I gathered. One afternoon, I met my friend Clara for coffee. She'd been through her own messy divorce years earlier and carried herself with a calm that came from surviving. I told her everything, the calls, the rumors, the request to extend support. She stirred her drink slowly. "He thinks you're a safety net," she said, "not a person." The words stung because they were true. "So what do I do?" I asked. She met my eyes. "You stop cushioning the fall he refuses to prepare for." That night, I drafted an email to my lawyer. I attached screenshots, call logs, notes I'd been keeping quietly in a folder called Personal. As I hit send, my hands trembled, not with fear, but with something closer to anticipation. For the first time since the divorce, I wasn't reacting. I was acting. And Mark had no idea that the world he thought he was comfortably resting in was about to shift under his feet. The reply from my lawyer came the next morning, short and measured. "You were right to document. This changes things." I read that sentence 3 times before setting my phone down. Outside my office window, the city moved like it always had. Cars stopping and starting, people crossing streets with coffee cups in hand. The world hadn't paused for my quiet realization, but something inside me had shifted its footing. For the first time in a long while, I felt steady. My lawyer, Evelyn, asked me to come in that afternoon. Her office was bright, minimalist, white walls, a single plant in the corner that somehow managed to thrive on neglect. She listened without interrupting as I laid everything out: the calls, the comments from his sister, the social media posts, his request to extend support. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and folded her hands. "He's not acting in good faith," she said simply. I nodded. "I don't want to hurt him. I just don't want to be responsible for him forever." Evelyn gave a small, knowing smile. "Wanting fairness isn't cruelty." She explained the process slowly, carefully, how temporary support depended on effort, how courts didn't look kindly on people who chose not to work while claiming hardship, how documentation, real documentation, could turn the narrative on its head. "What happens next?" I asked. "We request a review," she said, "and we present evidence." Evidence. The word felt heavier than I expected. It wasn't just screenshots and dates. It was the story of our marriage, reframed without excuses. Over the next few weeks, Mark's behavior grew bolder, as if he sensed time on his side. He called to complain about his car needing repairs. He texted photos of empty cabinets. Once he showed up at my house unannounced, standing on the porch like he still belonged there. "I was in the neighborhood," he said, glancing past me into the living room. "You can't just come by," I replied, keeping my voice calm. He scoffed. "Relax, it's not like I'm asking to move back in." The irony almost made me laugh. Instead, I handed him an envelope, his support check. He took it without looking at me. "You know, this would all be easier if you didn't make it so awkward." I watched him walk back to his car, the envelope already tucked under his arm like it was owed. The review hearing was scheduled for early spring. Until then, life went on in strange, suspended ways. At work, I focused harder than ever. At home, I reorganized rooms, donated his old things, repainted walls he'd once insisted stay neutral. Each small change felt like reclaiming space. Mark, meanwhile, played his part. He told mutual friends how stressful the divorce had been on him, how he was trying and felt unsupported. Someone even told me he joked about being retired early. I stopped correcting people. Let him talk, Evelyn had advised. Every inconsistency would speak for itself. The day of the hearing arrived gray and damp. Rain streaked the courthouse windows like the sky was holding its breath. I sat on a wooden bench, my coat folded neatly in my lap, listening to the murmur of other cases being called. Mark walked in late. He wore a suit that didn't quite fit anymore, his tie slightly crooked. When he saw me, he smiled, that same confident, crooked smile, and gave a small wave. I didn't return it. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with old paper and quiet tension. The judge, a woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper voice, reviewed the case summary. Mark's lawyer spoke first. He painted a picture of a man lost after divorce, a man struggling to re-enter the workforce, a man dependent on temporary support while he found his footing. Mark nodded along, head bowed just enough to look humble. Then it was our turn. Evelyn stood, calm and precise. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't dramatize. She simply presented facts. Job listings Mark hadn't applied to, social media posts time-stamped during work hours, bank statements showing discretionary spending, messages where he admitted he wasn't looking for work because there was no rush. I watched Mark's face change as each piece landed. The smile faded. His jaw tightened. The judge looked at him. "Mr. Harris," she said, "can you explain why you've made no documented effort to secure employment in the past 6 months?" Mark cleared his throat. I was dealing with emotional fallout." The judge nodded once. "Divorce is difficult, but it does not exempt one from personal responsibility." Silence filled the room. When the ruling came, it was firm. Support would be reduced immediately. A clear timeline was set for termination. Continued payments would require proof of active job searching. Mark stared at the floor. I felt something then, not triumph, not joy, but release, like setting down a weight I'd been carrying without realizing how heavy it was. Outside the courthouse, Mark caught up to me. "You didn't have to do that," he said low. "He could have just talked to me." I looked at him for a long moment. Rain speckled his suit, darkening the fabric. "I did talk to you," I said quietly. "You just didn't listen." He scoffed. "So this is revenge?" "No," I replied. "This is reality." He shook his head. "You've changed." I almost told him the truth, that I hadn't changed at all. I'd just stopped carrying him. But I didn't say anything. I walked away. The aftermath came faster than I expected. Within days, Mark's tone shifted. Calls turned sharp, texts accusatory. He told people I'd blindsided him, that I'd weaponized the system, that I'd been cold. And then, slowly, people stopped believing him. Mutual friends began asking questions. Denise called, her voice tight, asking why Mark was suddenly asking her for money. "He said you cut him off," she said. "I followed the court order." Silence. "I didn't know," she murmured. I didn't gloat. I didn't explain further. The truth has a way of traveling on its own. Weeks later, I heard Mark had taken a job, part-time, nothing glamorous. Someone mentioned he seemed bitter, restless. But he was working. As for me, I felt lighter, not because he was struggling, but because I wasn't being drained. One evening, I sat on my back porch as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in soft oranges and purples. The air smelled like damp earth and blooming flowers. For the first time in years, my future felt like mine again, and Mark's world, the one he thought he could float through on my effort, had finally met the ground. The real consequences didn't come from the courtroom. They came quietly through phone calls that stopped coming, invitations that dried up, and a shift in the way people said Mark's name when I wasn't in the room. At first, I didn't notice. I was too busy rediscovering what it felt like to live without anticipating someone else's needs before my own. I took longer walks after dinner, let laundry sit overnight without guilt. I bought flowers for no reason other than they smelled like spring. But slowly, the echoes reached me. One afternoon, my phone rang while I was folding towels. Denise's name lit up the screen. I hesitated before answering. "Hi," I said. She didn't waste time. "Mark's been asking around," she said, her voice tired. "He says you ruined his life." I leaned against the counter, the cotton warm in my hands. Did I? There was a pause, then a sigh. "No," she admitted, "I don't think you did." She told me how Mark had moved from couch to couch after his lease ended, how he complained about the job he'd taken, how he told anyone who'd listen that the system was unfair. "But when we ask what he's doing to change things," she said, "he gets angry." I closed my eyes. It was the same anger I'd lived with for years, now exposed without me to absorb it. "I'm sorry he's struggling," I said honestly, "but I can't fix it for him." Denise's voice softened. "I see that now." That conversation marked a shift. Mark's story began to crack under its own weight. People noticed patterns, the same complaints, the same lack of accountability. Without my quiet support smoothing his edges, his flaws stood bare. At a mutual friend's birthday dinner, someone mentioned him offhandedly. "He's always been like that," another person said. "He just had someone covering for him." I wasn't there to hear it, but the words found their way back to me. They sat in my chest not as vindication, but as understanding. I hadn't changed the narrative. I'd simply stepped out of it. Mark, meanwhile, didn't let go easily. He emailed me late one night, a long message filled with half apologies and blame stitched together so tightly they were hard to separate. "I never thought you'd turn on me like this. After everything I did for you, you know I wouldn't be in this position if you hadn't pushed me." I read it once, then again. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. For years I would have responded, explained, defended, tried to soothe. This time I closed the laptop. The next morning I forwarded the email to my lawyer and blocked his number. That boundary, simple, clean, felt like the final lock clicking into place. The weeks that followed were quieter, not empty, peaceful. I started seeing a therapist, something I'd postponed for years because there was always something more urgent. In that softly lit room, I learned how much of myself I'd folded away to keep a marriage standing. "You were surviving," she said once, "not living." I let those words settle. I reconnected with friends I'd drifted from, ones who didn't need explanations, who laughed easily, who didn't ask me to carry their weight. One Saturday, I hosted a small dinner, nothing fancy, pasta, salad, bread still warm from the oven. As we sat around the table, glasses clinking, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: belonging. Mark showed up again in my life, unexpectedly, through a letter. Not an email, not a text, a letter. The envelope was creased, his handwriting familiar and uneven. I stared at it for a long moment before opening it. Inside, the tone was different, less sharp, more tired. He wrote about his job, about how hard it was to start over at his age, about how lonely he felt. Then he wrote, "I didn't realize how much you did until you stopped." That line caught in my throat. He didn't apologize outright. He didn't take full responsibility, but for the first time he acknowledged the imbalance. I folded the letter and set it aside. I didn't write back. Some acknowledgments don't require responses. Some realizations have to echo in the quiet before they mean anything. Months passed. Support payments ended as scheduled. Mark stopped reaching out. The world adjusted around both of us, settling into new shapes. I heard through others that he'd moved again, this time to a smaller place farther out, that he was working more hours, that he seemed subdued. I wished him no harm, but I also wished him no shelter from consequences that weren't mine to prevent. One evening, as summer stretched long and golden, I sat on my porch with a glass of iced tea, listening to cicadas hum. The air was thick, alive. I thought about how revenge had never been my goal. What I'd wanted, what I'd needed, was justice, balance, a return of dignity. And in standing firm and letting the truth stand on its own, I'd found something better than revenge. I'd found myself again. Healing didn't arrive all at once. It came in small, ordinary moments, so subtle I almost missed them. Like the morning I woke up before my alarm, sunlight slipping through the curtains, and realized I wasn't bracing myself for the day. There was no knot in my stomach, no mental checklist of what Mark might need or what mood I'd have to manage. Just quiet. I lay there for a while, listening to the house breathe, the faint creak of wood as it warmed, a bird calling somewhere close. It struck me then how long I'd lived with constant noise, emotional noise, even when the rooms were silent. Peace felt unfamiliar at first, almost suspicious. I began to rebuild my routines with intention, not as distractions, but as choices. I took a pottery class on Wednesday evenings, my hands learning patience as clay spun under my palms. I cooked slower meals. I said no without explaining. Each boundary felt like a stitch closing something that had been left open for too long. People noticed the change. "You seem lighter," a coworker said one afternoon as we walked to the parking lot. "I am," I replied, surprised by how easily the words came. Mark's name came up less and less. When it did, it no longer carried the weight it once had. He became a footnote instead of a headline. Then one day he appeared again, this time in person. I was leaving the grocery store, my arms full, when I heard my name. I turned. Mark stood near the entrance, thinner than I remembered, his shoulders sloped like he was carrying something heavy. He didn't smile this time. "I didn't know you shopped here," he said. "I live nearby." We stood there awkwardly, shoppers weaving around us, carts rattling past. "I just wanted to say," he hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "You were right." I waited. "You thought I'd always be there," he continued, "that you'd handle things like you always did." The honesty in his voice startled me, not because it was dramatic, but because it was plain. "That wasn't fair," he added quietly. I nodded. "No, it wasn't." He looked at me then, really looked. "You don't owe me anything," he said. Something loosened in my chest. "I know," I replied. We parted without hugs, without promises, just two people acknowledging a truth that had taken too long to surface. As I walked to my car, groceries balanced against my hip, I didn't feel victorious. I felt complete. In the months that followed, my life continued to expand, not outward, but inward. I redecorated the spare room into a reading nook, soft chair, warm lamp, shelves that held books I'd been meaning to read for years. I filled the space with things that reflected me, not us. I hosted Sunday dinners again, laughter echoing through rooms that once held tension. I listened more. I spoke honestly. I let myself be supported instead of always offering support. One night, as I washed dishes after friends had left, I caught my reflection in the window. Tired, but peaceful. Older, but stronger. I thought about the woman I'd been at the beginning of all this, the one who'd written checks with shaking hands, who doubted herself even as she held everything together. I wished I could reach back and tell her something simple. You're allowed to stop carrying people who refuse to walk. Mark's life didn't magically improve, neither did mine become perfect, but it became mine. And that, I learned, was enough. Because revenge isn't about watching someone fall. Sometimes it's about standing still long enough to let them face the ground on their own, while you finally step forward. Even after the dust settled, even after Mark faded into a quieter version of himself, the story didn't end cleanly. Life rarely does. What followed was a season of reckoning, not with him, but with the years I had lived bent just slightly forward, always compensating. I began to notice how that habit showed up everywhere. At work, I took on extra projects without being asked. With friends, I listened more than I spoke. I apologized for things that weren't mine. Letting go of Mark hadn't automatically undone those patterns. It had only made them visible. My therapist called it muscle memory. You learned to survive by overfunctioning, she said gently. Your body still thinks that's necessary. So I practiced stopping. Not dramatically, just enough to feel the discomfort. When a coworker hinted I might handle a task outside my role, I said, I can't take that on right now. My voice wobbled, but I didn't backtrack. When a family member vented for an hour without pausing, I interrupted, not rudely, just honestly, and said, I need a break from this conversation. Each time, the world didn't collapse. Instead, it adjusted. There were moments, though quiet ones, when grief surfaced unexpectedly. Not grief for Mark, but for the version of myself that had believed love required endurance without reciprocity. One evening, I found an old photo while sorting through a box in the closet. It was from our early years. Mark had his arm around me, both of us smiling in that unguarded way people do before life teaches them caution. I sat on the floor, the photo resting on my knee, and let myself feel it. The warmth, the hope, the sadness. We hadn't started broken. That mattered. Acknowledging that didn't weaken me, it humanized the past. It reminded me that staying as long as I did wasn't stupidity, it was faith. But faith, I had learned, must be mutual to survive. Not long after that, I ran into Mark one last time, truly last, at a community fundraiser. A mutual acquaintance had invited us both, unaware of the history. The room buzzed with conversation and clinking glasses. Mark stood near the back, nursing a drink, his posture more reserved than I remembered. When our eyes met, he gave a small nod. I returned it. Later, as I stepped outside for air, he joined me. "He heard you're doing well," he said. "I am," I replied. He hesitated. "I am too, in my own way." I believed him. Not because his life looked impressive, but because his voice no longer carried entitlement, it carried effort. "I'm glad," I said. We stood in silence for a moment, the night cool and still. "I used to think you leaving ruined everything," he admitted. "Now I see it forced me to grow up." I looked at him then, really looked. The man he was becoming was not someone I wished to return to, but someone I no longer needed to escape from. "I hope you keep growing," I said. He smiled faintly. "I hope you keep choosing yourself." We went our separate ways, and that was that. No drama, no lingering threads. Closure, I realized, isn't a speech or a moment. It's the absence of tension where it once lived. In the years that followed, my life continued to widen, not louder, just fuller. I traveled alone for the first time, standing on a quiet beach at dawn, the smell of salt thick in the air. I made decisions without consulting anyone else's comfort. I rested without guilt. Sometimes people asked me if I regretted how things ended. I always answered honestly. "No," I said. "I regret how long I believed my value was tied to how much I gave." That belief had nearly cost me myself. What Mark taught me, unintentionally, was that love without responsibility becomes entitlement, and entitlement left unchecked will take everything it's allowed to. The world didn't shake when I stopped giving him a place to land. It corrected itself. And in that correction, I learned the quiet power of standing firm, not to punish, not to prove, but to live truthfully. I didn't win by watching his world shake. I won by building one that no longer depended on his balance. The maple tree out front still drops its leaves every fall. The house still creaks in the mornings. Life remains ordinary in the best ways. But now, when I sit in silence, it's not heavy, it's mine. Time has a way of smoothing the sharp edges, but it doesn't erase the lessons. It just makes them easier to hold. A year passed, then another. Seasons folded into each other quietly, like pages turned without announcement. I stopped measuring my life by what I'd escaped and started noticing what I was building. There was a promotion at work I almost didn't apply for, not because I wasn't qualified, but because a familiar voice inside me whispered, "Do you really want more responsibility?" That voice sounded a lot like the woman I used to be, the one who already carried too much. I applied anyway. When I got the position, I sat alone in my car afterward, hands resting on the steering wheel, breathing slowly. Not from nerves, from recognition. I was no longer afraid of success being taken from me or turned against me. This time, what I earned stayed mine. With the promotion came subtle shifts, new colleagues, new expectations, a new sense of authority that didn't require me to over-explain or soften my words. I learned that firmness could coexist with kindness and that neither required sacrifice. At home, I continued making small changes. I replaced the old couch Mark had insisted on keeping long after its springs gave out. I hung art that spoke to me, abstract, imperfect, honest. The house felt less like a museum of compromises and more like a living thing again. Sometimes late at night, I would sit in the quiet and think about money, not with fear, but with clarity. I reviewed my finances the way I always had, but now there was no shadow attached to the numbers, no second person whose choices I had to predict or protect against. Planning felt empowering instead of exhausting. That was when I understood something that had taken me years to articulate. It wasn't the money Mark had taken that hurt the most. It was the assumption that he was entitled to it simply because I existed beside him. That entitlement had threaded itself through our marriage so slowly I hadn't noticed it tightening. Each time I paid instead of questioned, each time I carried instead of challenged, each time I told myself love meant understanding. Understanding, I learned, must have limits. One afternoon, I received an email from an unfamiliar address. It took me a moment to realize it was from Mark's new employer, CCing him by mistake on a routine verification request. I almost forwarded it without comment. Then I stopped. I forwarded it to him with a short note. I believe this was sent to me in error. Best of luck. He replied quickly. Thank you. I appreciate it. No guilt, no resentment, just professionalism. It felt like crossing paths with someone from a former life, a version of yourself you no longer recognize but don't resent. Later that evening, I took a long walk through my neighborhood. The sidewalks were cracked in familiar places. Porch lights flickered on one by one. Somewhere nearby, someone was cooking dinner, garlic and oil warming the air. I thought about how Mark had once believed he could live off me after the divorce, not just financially, but emotionally, socially, narratively. He had believed I would always be the stable ground beneath his feet, even when he refused to stand on his own. What shook his world wasn't what I did to him, it was what I stopped doing. And in stopping, I didn't harden, I didn't become cruel or cold, I became clear. Clarity is unsettling to people who survive on ambiguity. That truth revealed itself again when a younger colleague confided in me about her marriage. She spoke in the same careful language I once used, minimizing, justifying, hoping things would improve if she tried harder. I listened quietly, then said only one thing. Pay attention to how much of yourself you're spending to keep the peace. She nodded slowly, tears welling. I didn't tell her to leave. I didn't tell her to stay. I trusted her to hear what she was ready to hear. That trust, once foreign to me, had become natural. The final ripple of Mark's assumption reached me unexpectedly through a legal notice. He had tried, quietly, to appeal the termination of support, citing ongoing financial instability. This time there was no panic. Evelyn handled it swiftly. The appeal was dismissed without hearing. I didn't even attend. When Evelyn called to tell me, her voice carried a note of finality. She said, "This is done. He has no standing." I thanked her and hung up, standing at my kitchen window watching rain trace familiar paths down the glass. I felt nothing dramatic, no surge of relief, no anger, just closure, settling like dust after a long road. That night, I cooked a simple meal and ate it at the table, alone but not lonely. I raised my glass, not in celebration, but in acknowledgement of endurance, of growth, of boundaries learned the hard way. Mark had believed my strength was something he could lean on indefinitely. What he never understood was that strength, when respected, supports others, but when exploited, it withdraws. And when it does, the world shifts, not because of revenge, but because balance is restored. I turned off the lights, the house dimming around me, and went to bed with an easy breath in my chest. Tomorrow would be another ordinary day, and that, I had learned, was the greatest victory of all. ordinary days began to stack up in a way that felt almost sacred. Mornings where I drank my coffee slowly instead of gulping it down between obligations. Afternoons where I left work on time without inventing reasons to justify it. Evenings where the silence wasn't something to fill, but something to sink into. I used to think peace would feel louder, more triumphant. Instead, it arrived softly, like a habit forming. There were moments when I tested it, when old instincts stirred and I wondered if I should be doing more, giving more, proving something. Those moments passed quicker now. I recognized them for what they were, echoes. One Saturday, I cleaned out the last box from the garage, the one I'd avoided because it held things that didn't belong anywhere else. Old cables, instruction manuals for appliances long gone, a pair of work gloves Mark had left behind. I picked them up, turning them over in my hands. The leather was cracked, stiff with age. Once, those gloves had symbolized something to me: effort, contribution, partnership. Now, they were just gloves. I tossed them into the donation pile without ceremony. That act, small as it was, felt like a punctuation mark. Not everything needs a ritual. Some endings are meant to be practical. A few weeks later, I hosted my sister for dinner. She'd watched the entire marriage from the sidelines, offering support when I asked for it, holding her tongue when I didn't. As we cleared the table, she looked at me and said, "You know, I worried about you for a long time." "I know," I said gently. "You always seemed tired," she continued. "Not physically, just like you were bracing." I leaned against the counter, drying my hands. "I was." She nodded, then smiled. "You don't anymore." That observation stayed with me. I thought about how many years I'd spent bracing for reactions, for disappointment, for blame, for being told I wasn't doing enough even when I was doing everything. Living without that constant tension was like stepping out of a strong wind and realizing how much energy it had taken just to stand upright. Mark's absence from my daily life became complete, not because I erased him, but because he no longer occupied space that wasn't his. I didn't check his social media, didn't ask mutual acquaintances for updates. When his name came up, it no longer pulled me backward. He became part of my history, not my present. One afternoon, I received a message from a woman I barely knew, someone who had once been close to Mark. We'd exchanged polite hellos in the past, nothing more. Her message was careful. "I hope this isn't strange. I just wanted to say, I understand now." I stared at the screen, unsure how to respond. She continued, "I dated him briefly. He spoke about you a lot, about how strong you were, how you handled everything. But he also expected that strength to carry him. When I didn't, things ended." I exhaled slowly. I wrote back a single sentence. "I hope you're doing well." She replied with a heart emoji and nothing else. I didn't feel validated. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt finished. The lesson had traveled far enough. That evening, I went for a drive with no destination in mind, windows down, radio low. The road stretched out under a sky just beginning to dim. I thought about how Mark's world had shaken, not because I set out to shake it, but because it had been built on an assumption that no longer held. That assumption that someone else would always compensate for his choices had insulated him from growth. Removing that insulation hadn't been cruel, it had been necessary. I pulled over near a small park and stepped out, the air cool against my skin. Families were packing up picnics, children ran ahead laughing, their voices carrying across the grass. I watched them for a moment and thought about legacy. Not the kind etched into names or titles, but the quiet kind, the kind passed on through behavior, through boundaries, through the courage to say, "This is where I end and you begin." If someone watched my life now, I hoped they wouldn't see a woman who got revenge. I hoped they'd see a woman who reclaimed herself without bitterness, because bitterness would mean I was still tethered. I wasn't. The night deepened and I drove home, headlights cutting through the dark. Inside the house, everything was where I left it. No tension waiting, no unresolved conversations hanging in the air. I moved through the rooms with ease. In the bedroom, I paused by the window, looking out at the maple tree silhouetted against the streetlight. Leaves rustled softly, detached, ready to fall when the time came. Letting go, I realized, doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like trust in yourself, in the process, in the idea that you don't need to extract anything from someone else's downfall to move forward. Mark had thought he could live off me after the divorce. What he hadn't understood was that I was done being a foundation for someone who refused to build. And once that foundation was removed, the shaking stopped on both sides. I turned off the light and climbed into bed, sleep coming easily. Tomorrow would be ordinary, and ordinary after everything felt extraordinary. There was a moment, some time after everything had settled, when I realized I no longer measured my life against what it used to be. The realization came quietly, the way most lasting truths do. I was standing in line at the pharmacy, half listening to the hum of conversation around me, when I caught my reflection in the convex mirror near the ceiling. I looked steady, not smiling, not frowning, just present. For years, I had existed in a constant state of comparison, before and after, better or worse, then and now. But standing there, holding a small basket with toothpaste and vitamins, I understood something had changed. I wasn't recovering anymore. I was living. That shift didn't erase the past, but it rearranged it. The memories of Mark no longer rose like warnings. They arrived like chapters already read, sometimes instructive, sometimes sad, but closed. I stopped referring to him as my ex-husband in my head. He became Mark, a person who had been part of my life and no longer was. Language matters, even the words we use in silence. That spring, I made a decision that surprised even me. I refinanced the house, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to. Sitting across from the loan officer, I felt none of the anxiety that used to accompany financial decisions. No inner calculations about how Mark might react, no mental rehearsals of how to justify the choice. When the papers were signed, I drove home with the windows down, the smell of cut grass drifting in, and laughed out loud. It felt good to make decisions without asking permission from anyone, including my former self. A few weeks later, I hosted a small gathering to celebrate a friend's milestone. The house filled with familiar voices, music playing softly in the background. At one point, someone asked how I'd managed the divorce so gracefully. I hesitated before answering. I didn't, I said honestly. I managed it truthfully. They looked puzzled, so I continued. I stopped pretending I could carry someone else's life without losing my own. That was the clearest explanation I could offer. Later that night, as I cleaned up alone, I thought about how often women are praised for endurance, for patience, for self-sacrifice disguised as love. Rarely are we praised for stopping. Mark's world had shaken because I stopped filling the cracks, and while people often assume revenge requires action, what I learned is this: withdrawal can be seismic, not because it punishes, but because it reveals. I didn't orchestrate his fall. I didn't sabotage his reputation. I didn't demand sympathy or public apologies. I simply stepped out of the role he had written for me. And without that role, his story had to change. Sometimes I caught myself wondering what might have happened if I'd confronted him earlier, if I'd drawn firmer boundaries sooner, if I'd asked for more. Those questions didn't haunt me the way they once did. I answered them gently. I did what I could with what I knew at the time. Growth doesn't run backward. One afternoon, I received a forwarded message from Evelyn, just a formality. Mark had closed his last appeal attempt. No further legal ties remained. Congratulations, you're officially free of this chapter. I stared at the word free. Freedom, I'd learned, wasn't about escaping something. It was about no longer being claimed by it. That evening, I went for a long walk as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in soft pinks and grays. The neighborhood was quiet. Lights flicked on one by one, each house holding its own story. I passed the park where I'd once sat and thought about revenge, wondering if standing firm would make me cruel. It hadn't. It had made me honest. And honesty, when paired with boundaries, has a way of rearranging power without ever raising its voice. I paused on a bench and let the cool wood press against my palms. I thought about Mark, not with resentment, but with clarity. He believed he could live off me after the divorce because for years he had lived off me during the marriage, not just financially, but emotionally, structurally, invisibly. When that support ended, it didn't destroy him, it challenged him. And while that challenge shook his world, it strengthened mine. That distinction mattered. I didn't need his suffering to feel whole. I needed my integrity. As dusk deepened, I stood and headed home, my steps unhurried. Inside the house, everything greeted me as it always did now. Calm, orderly, mine. I cooked dinner and ate it slowly. I read for a while. I turned in early. Lying in bed, I reflected on how different this ending was from the one I'd feared. I'd once imagined revenge as something sharp, dramatic, loud. But the truth was far quieter. The most powerful thing I did was refuse to continue enabling a lie that my purpose was to support someone who refused to support himself. When that lie ended, so did the imbalance, and in its place grew something steady, durable, and deeply rooted, a life that no longer shook when someone else leaned too hard, a life that stood on its own.